The white commercial jet began to shake violently as warning alarms echoed through the cabin, a sharp mechanical chorus that cut through the low murmur of passengers who only moments before had been settling into the monotony of a routine flight. Smoke filled the cockpit in slow, curling waves, blurring the digital displays and casting a pale haze over the tense faces of the flight crew as the captain issued a desperate Mayday call, his voice tight but controlled as the aircraft rapidly lost altitude and the pristine calm of the sky transformed into a scene of uncertainty and fear. The plane shuddered again, more fiercely this time, and overhead compartments rattled while oxygen masks trembled in their housings, threatening to drop as the turbulence grew more aggressive. Inside the cabin, the soft glow of reading lights flickered, replaced by the harsh blink of emergency indicators as passengers exchanged wide-eyed glances, silently asking questions no one could answer. The air, once cool and filtered, now carried the bitter tang of burning metal and overheated wiring, a scent that made stomachs tighten and throats dry as the realization set in that this was no ordinary patch of turbulence. The captain's grip tightened on the control yoke as he fought to stabilize the aircraft, his co-pilot working frantically to diagnose the source of the malfunction while communicating with air traffic control, voices overlapping in a mixture of technical jargon and urgent commands. In the passenger rows, a mother clutched her child closer, whispering reassurances she barely believed herself, while a businessman stared out the window at the rushing clouds, watching the horizon tilt at an unnatural angle. The hum of the engines changed pitch, dropping into a strained groan that vibrated through the floor and into every bone, as if the aircraft itself were groaning in protest against the forces tearing at it. Flight attendants moved swiftly through the aisles, their training guiding them to remain calm, to speak in steady tones, to remind everyone to fasten seatbelts and remain seated, even as their own eyes betrayed the growing tension. The plane dipped suddenly, causing a collective gasp to ripple through the cabin, a sound that united strangers in shared dread as they braced against their armrests and seatbacks. Outside, the once peaceful expanse of blue was now marred by thick, churning clouds, streaked with the faint electric glow of distant lightning, a chaotic backdrop to an unfolding emergency. The cockpit crew worked with relentless focus, isolating systems, rerouting power, attempting every procedure drilled into them through years of rigorous training as the altimeter numbers fell at an alarming rate. Sweat beaded along the captain's brow, tracing slow paths down his temples as he fought to keep the nose level, his mind racing through checklists while maintaining a steady stream of communication with ground control, who in turn scrambled to clear airspace and prepare emergency response teams on the nearest runway. In the cabin, time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously, seconds feeling like hours as the subtle rhythm of routine flight gave way to a tense, suspended silence broken only by the mechanical warnings and the occasional sob of a frightened passenger. A man whispered a prayer under his breath, his fingers tracing invisible symbols against his trembling knee, while a young couple clasped hands as if their grip alone could anchor them to safety. The aircraft lurched again, more violently than before, and a few bags slipped from the overhead bins, tumbling into the aisle with dull thuds that echoed like punctuation marks in a story no one wished to be part of. The smoke in the cockpit thickened, prompting the crew to don their oxygen masks, their voices now filtered through synthetic breath and crackling microphones as they coordinated their next move. The captain's Mayday transmission cut through the static, repeating position coordinates and distress details with unwavering resolve, a lifeline cast into the invisible network of controllers and responders standing ready below. Every vibration of the fuselage seemed amplified by the tension that gripped the cabin, each rattle and creak a reminder of the fragile barrier separating them from the open sky outside. Yet amidst the fear and uncertainty, a strange stillness settled over some, a quiet acceptance that mingled with hope as they waited for the aircraft to respond, for the trembling to ease, for the downward pull to slow. The jet continued its uneven descent, the ground far below drawing nearer with each passing moment, unseen but unmistakably closer, as the crew fought with unwavering determination to guide the struggling plane through the storm of alarms, smoke, and gravity, refusing to surrender to the chaos that had seized the once smooth and silent journey. Passengers clutched their seats in terror while flight attendants tried to keep calm, their expressions carefully composed even as their eyes revealed the strain of the moment, and outside the windows, dark clouds swirled as the jet struggled to stay stable in the stormy sky, a violent ballet of wind and pressure that tossed the aircraft like a fragile toy in an unforgiving ocean of air, each sudden drop pulling a chorus of gasps from the cabin and each sharp rise forcing breathless silence as everyone braced for what might come next, the hum of engines now drowned by the relentless roar of thunder that rolled endlessly around them like the growl of an unseen giant. The aisle lights flickered with every jolt, casting brief shadows that danced across pale faces, while overhead the plastic panels creaked and trembled under the strain of turbulent forces that showed no sign of mercy, and the once orderly rows of passengers now looked like a frozen tableau of fear, hands gripping armrests so tightly that knuckles blanched white, fingers intertwined in silent pleas, eyes wide with the raw realization that control had slipped beyond their reach. A child began to cry softly, the sound thin and fragile against the deep mechanical groans of the aircraft, and a nearby passenger tried to murmur soothing words, though their own voice quivered with uncertainty, while a man several rows ahead bowed his head, lips moving in a steady rhythm of prayer as the plane shuddered yet again with such force that loose items rattled and rolled along the floor. The storm outside intensified, clouds twisting and churning like dark mountains collapsing into each other, streaks of lightning briefly illuminating the cabin with a ghostly white flash that etched every fearful expression into sharp relief before plunging them back into shadow, and with every flash came another wave of turbulence that lifted stomachs and sent a ripple of dread through the steel body of the plane. Flight attendants moved carefully down the aisle, their steps measured and deliberate, offering calm instructions and gentle reassurances, reminding passengers to stay seated and fastened even as they themselves fought to keep balance, their practiced professionalism a thin but vital shield against the chaos unfolding around them. The air felt heavy, charged not only with static but with emotion, the kind of tension that wrapped around the chest and made every breath shallow, while whispers spread from seat to seat like nervous currents, questions about whether they would make it through, whether the storm would show mercy, whether the shaking would ever stop. The windows revealed a world transformed from peaceful blue to ominous gray, the horizon swallowed by roiling masses of cloud that seemed to close in from all sides, and the jet pitched slightly to one side, then the other, as if searching desperately for a pocket of calm that refused to appear. A woman pressed her forehead against the cool glass, staring into the chaos outside with a distant, hollow gaze, her reflection fractured by raindrops streaking rapidly across the surface, while behind her another passenger clutched a small metal cross, fingers trembling with each violent vibration that pulsed through the cabin. The sound of the engine surged and ebbed, a strained growl that hinted at the immense effort required to keep the aircraft aloft, and every unfamiliar noise sent a jolt of panic through the rows, people turning their heads sharply as if trying to identify the source, though all they could see was each other and the endless storm beyond. The sensation of weightlessness struck suddenly as the plane dipped, followed by a crushing heaviness as it corrected, stomachs lurching and hearts pounding in frantic synchrony, and the collective fear became almost tangible, a silent force binding everyone together in a shared moment of vulnerability. The storm pressed on relentlessly, wind hammering the fuselage as though testing every rivet and seam, and inside the cabin a fragile stillness occasionally settled between jolts, a suspended moment where no one spoke, no one moved, where every soul simply waited for the next tremor to announce itself. Then it would come again, a violent shake that rattled teeth and bones, pulling half-stifled cries and sharp intakes of breath, the reality of the situation sinking deeper into every mind as hope and fear battled quietly beneath the surface. Yet through it all, the flight attendants continued their steady efforts, offering comforting touches, measured smiles, and calm tones that attempted to anchor the cabin in some semblance of normality, even as the storm outside painted a picture of raw, unrestrained power, a reminder of how small and fragile they were in the vastness of the sky. Time seemed to lose its meaning, stretching into an endless sequence of turbulence and anxious waiting, each minute blending into the next as the jet fought for stability, its wings slicing through angry air with stubborn determination, and every passenger, every soul on board, clung not only to their seats but to the silent hope that somehow, against all odds, the storm would pass and the shaking would subside, allowing them once more to breathe freely beneath calmer skies. Suddenly, a fighter jet appeared, flying close alongside the damaged plane, its sleek metallic body cutting through the storm like a silver blade, and for a brief moment the sheer shock of its presence eclipsed the fear that had dominated the cabin, as passengers leaned toward the windows with stunned expressions, watching the powerful military aircraft glide into view with precise, unwavering control, its navigation lights blinking steadily through the swirling darkness of the clouds as if offering a silent promise of guidance and protection. The pilot of the commercial aircraft, already struggling with failing systems and unstable controls, felt a surge of cautious relief as the fighter jet moved into a parallel position, close enough to see but far enough to remain safe, and through the crackle of strained radio transmissions, a firm and confident voice broke through the static, identifying the escort and issuing clear, concise instructions that cut through the chaos like a lifeline. The fighter pilot guided the commercial aircraft, signaling emergency directions to lead it toward the nearest safe runway, banking slightly to indicate the required heading, then leveling out to show the safest angle of descent as the storm continued to rage around them. Inside the cockpit, The captain adjusted his course carefully, following the visual cues and radio guidance with unwavering focus, his hands moving steadily despite the tremors rippling through the controls, while the co-pilot monitored every gauge and display, calling out readings and confirming responses in a tense but coordinated rhythm. In the cabin, whispers shifted from pure panic to fragile hope, as the sight of the escorting jet ignited a quiet realization that help had arrived, that they were no longer alone in the vast, unforgiving sky. Faces that had been pale with terror now reflected cautious anticipation, though fear still lingered in every breath and every heartbeat as the plane continued its uneasy struggle against gravity and storm. The fighter jet maintained its position with remarkable precision, its wings steady against the violent winds, as if demonstrating calm authority in the midst of chaos, and its pilot used hand signals and subtle maneuvers to reinforce the spoken instructions, guiding the damaged aircraft through pockets of turbulence and steering it away from the most dangerous sections of the storm. Lightning flashed around them, briefly illuminating both aircraft in stark white light, revealing the immense contrast between the sleek agility of the fighter and the lumbering, wounded state of the commercial jet, yet the fighter did not waver, holding its course like a vigilant guardian. The commercial pilot's eyes remained locked on the Escort, using it as a moving beacon, aligning his approach to match every intentional tilt and turn, adjusting altitude gradually as directed, the altimeter ticking downward in measured increments that felt both terrifying and reassuring. Below, the ground crew prepared for an emergency landing, unaware to the passengers but essential to the fragile thread of survival forming beneath them, while above, the storm clouds began to thin slightly, their dense, oppressive mass giving way to brief glimpses of clearer sky as the fighter jet led the way toward safer airspace. The plane rocked violently once more, but this time the captain anticipated the motion, compensating with trained precision, guided by the steady presence of the Escort that refused to abandon its post. In the cabin, a hush fell over the passengers, a collective silence filled with silent prayers, whispered hopes, and tearful glances exchanged between strangers who now shared a bond forged in fear and resilience. Some pressed their foreheads to the windows, watching the fighter jet's movements with rapt attention, while others closed their eyes, drawing strength from the knowledge that someone else was taking control, that a path toward survival was being carved just ahead of them. The intercom crackled to life as the captain informed everyone that an escort had arrived and they were being guided to safety, his voice steady despite the strain, and a ripple of emotional reaction swept through the cabin, a mixture of relief, disbelief, and renewed tension as the reality of the situation settled deeper. The fighter jet pitched slightly downward, signaling the beginning of a controlled descent, and the commercial pilot followed, lowering the nose carefully as the plane responded sluggishly, every movement demanding delicate precision and unyielding concentration. The storm relented in uneven bursts, the wind howling less violently, the turbulence easing just enough to allow the aircraft to maintain a more stable path, though the danger was far from over. With every mile they traveled, the lights of the distant runway grew a little brighter, faint at first, then slowly more defined through the haze of rain and cloud, a distant constellation on the darkened earth that represented hope itself. The fighter jet continued to signal, ensuring the commercial plane aligned correctly with the approach path, guiding it through the final corridor of unpredictable air, its presence a constant reassurance as the runway drew nearer. Inside the cabin, breathing slowed just slightly, though every passenger remained tense, muscles rigid, eyes fixed forward or closed in silent concentration, waiting for the moment when fear would finally give way to safety. The escorting fighter held its position until the last possible moment before the approach threshold, its pilot giving a final signal of encouragement and precision, and though the storm still whispered its threats around them, the path was now clear, the direction unmistakable, and the commercial aircraft continued forward under guidance, every second bringing them closer to the fragile but powerful promise of solid ground. With engines failing and fuel running low, the white jet descended sharply, its wounded frame slicing through the churning air while every vibration echoed like a warning of imminent impact, and hearts pounded as the ground rushed closer, every second feeling like the last as the altimeter numbers dropped with merciless speed and the landscape below shifted from an indistinct blur to a terrifyingly clear patchwork of dark earth, scattered lights, and shadowed terrain that seemed to rise up in desperate anticipation of collision. Inside the cockpit, the captain fought with every ounce of strength and focus left within him, his hands gripping the controls so tightly that his knuckles burned, sweat stinging his eyes as he tried to coax life from systems that had already begun to surrender, while alarms shrieked in relentless monotony like the final cries of a machine on the verge of collapse. The co-pilot monitored the dwindling fuel levels with increasing dread, calling out updates in clipped, strained tones as they adjusted flaps, recalibrated thrust, and attempted to balance lift against gravity in a dance that felt more like defiance than calculation. The nose of the aircraft dipped again, a sickening lurch that sent a wave of icy fear through every passenger, and in the cabin the sense of gravity intensified, pressing bodies deeper into their seats as if the sky itself were trying to claim them. Some screamed, others clamped hands over their mouths, and a few remained eerily silent, their eyes glassy as they stared forward, motionless, suspended between terror and resignation. Outside the windows, the ground no longer felt distant or abstract, it was real, brutally close, racing upward in a blur of speed that made breathing feel impossible. The sound of the failing engines transformed into a tortured whine, sputtering unevenly as if gasping for one final effort, and each fluctuation sent shockwaves of panic through the cabin as passengers listened for any hint that the plane might stabilize. A flight attendant stumbled but quickly regained balance, forcing a trembling smile as she urged everyone to stay seated, her voice trembling despite her attempts to project calm authority, while tears silently streamed down her cheeks, unnoticed by those too consumed by their own fear to see anything beyond the moment. The jet descended faster, the horizon no longer an endless line but a tilting edge that painted the terrifying reality of their situation, and the weight of inevitability settled over the cabin like a heavy fog. A man clutched the photograph in his wallet, his thumb brushing the worn edges as if drawing strength from familiar faces, while a young woman beside him whispered broken prayers, her voice barely audible over the roar of rushing air and the mechanical screams echoing through the fuselage. Children cried for their parents, and parents held their children closer than ever, pressing kisses into their hair as if it might be the last chance to feel their warmth. Every jolt, every tremor, every unnatural sound reverberated through bones and nerves, amplifying the unbearable awareness that they were falling, that the sky was no longer holding them, that time itself had become a narrowing corridor hurtling toward a single, unforgiving point. The captain's voice came over the intercom, strained yet resolute, instructing everyone to brace for impact, and the words landed like a final verdict, pulling sharp sobs and breathless silence in equal measure. Seatbelts were tightened, heads lowered, arms crossed, and the collective body of passengers curled inward in a desperate attempt to shield themselves from the unknown violence that awaited. The plane shuddered again, violently this time, as if protesting the fate imposed upon it, and for a fleeting second a pocket of stillness followed, a haunting calm that made the roaring wind outside sound distant, muffled, unreal. In that stillness, thoughts raced through minds at lightning speed, memories flashing like fragments of a life being reviewed in its final moments, the sound of laughter, the warmth of sunlight, familiar voices echoing from safer days, all colliding with the brutal reality of the present. Then the descent steepened once more, the earth surging closer in a terrifying rush, and the cabin was filled with a chorus of cries, gasps, and whispered goodbyes as the aircraft plunged onward, each heartbeat hammering with the unbearable knowledge that they were seconds away from whatever awaited below, hope and terror intertwined in a final spiral as the white jet fought desperately against the inevitable pull of gravity. In the final moment, the escorted jet touched the runway with a hard but controlled landing, the wheels slamming against the concrete with a jarring force that sent a violent tremor through the entire fuselage, yet instead of the feared shattering impact there came the unmistakable grinding scream of rubber meeting tarmac, a sound that, in that instant, transformed from something terrifying into the most beautiful reassurance anyone on board had ever heard, and as the aircraft bounced once, then settled, skidding forward in a long, strained struggle to decelerate, a wave of stunned silence swept through the cabin before breaking into a raw eruption of cheers, sobs, and trembling laughter as everyone realized they had survived the critical Mayday situation that only moments before had felt like an unavoidable end. Bodies that had been rigid with fear loosened as if released from an invisible vice, shoulders sagging, heads dropping back against seats, and hands that had gripped armrests in desperate defiance now flew to faces, covering eyes filled with tears that flowed freely, not only from fear but from the overwhelming relief of life preserved against impossible odds. The jet continued to slow, the roar of reverse thrust vibrating through the metal shell, while outside emergency vehicles raced alongside, their flashing lights painting streaks of red and blue across the windows like a surreal celebration of survival, and inside the cabin the energy shifted from terror to disbelief as stunned passengers looked at one another with expressions that asked the same silent question, are we really safe, is this real, is it finally over? Some began to clap, the sound uncertain at first, then swelling into a thunderous applause that rolled through the rows like a living heartbeat, strangers turning into companions, nodding through tears, embracing awkwardly in narrow aisles, offering whispered words of gratitude to anyone within reach as the plane finally slowed to a steady crawl and came to a complete stop. The engines fell into a quiet hum, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the oppressive alarms faded away, replaced by a profound stillness that seemed almost sacred, as if the very air inside the cabin had taken a slow, trembling breath of relief. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, no longer strained with desperation but softened by exhaustion and emotion, announcing that the aircraft had landed safely and emergency crews were standing by, and a fresh wave of cheers burst forth, mingled with choked cries and murmurs of thanks that filled every corner of the cabin. Passengers who moments ago had been bracing for death now bowed their heads, whispered prayers, or simply stared ahead in quiet shock, trying to process the magnitude of what they had just lived through, the fragile line between disaster and survival that had somehow bent in their favor. A mother hugged her child so tightly that the little one giggled through tears, sensing the change in the air even if the details remained confusing, while an elderly man wiped his face with trembling hands, his lips forming words of gratitude to a world that had granted him another sunrise. Flight attendants, their own composure finally cracking, allowed tears to slip down their cheeks as they exchanged exhausted glances of relief, some pressing hands to their hearts while softly thanking passengers for their cooperation, their training and bravery now giving way to the deeply human emotion of having survived alongside everyone else. Outside, the fighter jet that had guided them so faithfully lifted away into the sky, its mission complete, and those who caught sight of it through the windows watched in awe and reverence, silently acknowledging the unseen heroism that had helped deliver them from a moment of catastrophic uncertainty. The reality of survival slowly settled in, not as a sudden burst but as a gentle, profound realization that crept through every thought and every breath, that life, fragile and precious, had been granted once more. As emergency personnel boarded and guided the process with calm efficiency, passengers unbuckled shakily, standing on unsteady legs that felt foreign after the tension of fear, yet each step toward the exit carried a new sense of gratitude, a quiet reverence for the fact that they were able to stand at all. Tears continued to flow, some silent, some accompanied by soft laughter and broken words, but all bound by a shared understanding that this was more than just a flight gone wrong, it was a moment that would remain etched in memory forever, a story of terror transformed into one of survival, of chaos bending into calm, of despair giving way to overwhelming relief. And as each passenger moved slowly down the aisle, leaving behind the silent, exhausted aircraft that had carried them through their darkest moments, hearts beat not with panic now but with awe and appreciation, knowing that against the most unforgiving circumstances, they had endured, they had lived, and in that final, fragile miracle of safe landing, they had reclaimed their future.